In my almost 4 years in the KSP community, I have noticed somewhat of a recurrent challenge. It is difficult to find up-to-date, accurate, and in-depth information about many of the various systems, game mechanics, and techniques that skilled players make use of. This results in outdated, or wrong, information continuing to circulate for years, or oftentimes for no information to exist at all. In this new tutorial series, I am going to do my best to present up-to-date, accurate information about some of the systems, game mechanics, and techniques that I hope will help the average KSP player level up their skills. Without further ado, let's get into episode 1. Drag is a relatively straightforward concept. When an object moves through a gas, it must push the molecules making up the gas out of the way. Since every action has an equal and opposite reaction, the gas pushes back. The equation that describes this, known very creatively as the drag equation, is pretty simple. Drag equals area times drag coefficient times the density of the gas times the velocity squared divided by 2. As a quick note, we're going to take the area and drag coefficient and roll them together into one unit, which we'll still call drag coefficient. The reason for this is that this is the value that KSP actually displays to us in the part data. So looking at this, density and velocity are pretty self-explanatory. But how does KSP calculate the coefficient of drag? For most parts other than wings, it does this by simulating each part using what are called drag cubes. This simulates a part using 6 faces represented by a set of 3 numbers each. To get the drag coefficient of a part in flight, these 18 numbers run through a series of transformations based on various factors such as angle of attack and Mach number. To view information about a part's drag cube, open the Alt F12 menu, then navigate to the Arrow tab under the Physics section. Select the checkbox for Display Arrow Data in Action menus. There are a number of different values in the debug data. Let's break them down. Mach, the current velocity of the part expressed as a multiple of the speed of sound. Drag vector, the orientation of the part relative to prograde velocity expressed as a unit vector. Drag, the total drag on the part in kilonewtons. ACD, the coefficient of drag of the part, or how draggy it is overall. The next 6 rows represent info on a part's drag characteristics in the 6 coordinate directions. When spawning a part into the spaceplane hangar, each of the faces corresponds to a direction as follows. XP, towards the right of the hangar. XN, towards the left of the hangar. YP, towards the front. YN, towards the back. ZP, towards the bottom. ZN, towards the top. Each of the 6 faces has 3 numbers associated with it. Oc-A, or occlusion area. This is the current unoccluded area of this face in square meters. This is the surface used for drag calculations, and it can be reduced via node attachment, but more on that later. WDRG, or weight drag. Think of this as a proto-drag coefficient for the face. Various transformations will be applied to reach a final drag coefficient. To put another way, this is how pointy the face is. 0 is so pointy that the face has no drag at all, and 1 is a perfectly flat plate. W area, or weight area. This is the total area of a face in square meters, but not counting any node attachment. This value is used alongside occlusion area for node attachment calculations. To get the full drag of a given face of the drag cube, the fully transformed weight drag value will be multiplied by the occlusion area value, and then used as the coefficient of drag in the drag equation. Now, let's take a look at the various transformations that get applied to the weight drag value. First, we take the baseline weight drag value and get the initial transform, which corresponds to the Mach 0 curve. Then, we raise it to a power based on Mach number to get a final transform. This will be somewhere between Mach 0 and Mach 5. As you can see, blunt faces with a weight drag close to 1 are only reduced by a small amount, whereas streamlined faces with a weight drag under about 0.4 are massively reduced by factors of up to and over 100. The next set of transforms determines the relative strengths of the 3 types of drag cube drag: frontal drag, rear drag, and skin drag. There's an additional multiplier to the overall drag. Up to about Mach 0.85, frontal and rear drag are approximately the same, but they quickly diverge, and by Mach 1.1 frontal drag is 11 times larger, growing to 26 times larger by Mach 5. On the other hand, skin drag is 50 times smaller subsonic and over 1,000 times smaller while supersonic. Finally, there is an additional overall drag multiplier. This is 0.5 below Mach 0.85, then spikes to 1.3 at Mach 1.1, before tapering off to 0.7 at Mach 2 and beyond. It remains relatively stable up to about Mach 7 before slowly rising again. It is important to note that the previous transformations represent the maximum possible multipliers for each of the three drag types. Depending on the facing of a given drag cube face, it will receive different percentages of those three maximum values. A given drag cube face receives maximum frontal drag when pointed directly into the airstream, and this reduces as cosine of the angle of attack as the face rotates away from the airstream, dropping to 0 when at a 90-degree angle. Skin drag begins with a value of 0 when facing directly into the airflow, rises to a maximum value at an angle of attack of 90 degrees, and then smoothly declines back to 0 as it reaches an angle of attack of 180 degrees. This follows the formula sine angle of attack. Rear drag has a maximum value at an angle of attack of 180 degrees, and smoothly declines to 0 as you go to an angle of attack of 90 degrees. This follows negative cosine of angle of attack. When taking into account that the base multiplier for skin drag is up to 1,000 times smaller than frontal or rear drag, this means for a given face, the optimal direction for it to be facing is at a 90-degree angle of attack to the airflow. In other words, the ideal situation for a part's drag is to have a streamlined face pointing directly into the airflow, taking only frontal drag, a top, bottom, left, and right face, each pointed perfectly perpendicular and therefore taking only skin drag, which is minimal, and finally, a streamlined rear face pointed directly away from the airflow, taking only rear drag. Okay, now let's try an example. Here we have a part with the velocity heading pointed straight forwards in the spaceplane hangar, while the part itself is rotated 45 degrees. This means that the velocity vector is directly between the XP and the YP faces of the part. We can see this represented in the drag vector, which has an X value of 0.7, a Y value of 0.7, and a Z value of 0. Thinking back to our angle of attack versus drag multiplier chart, we know that since both the XP and the YP faces are at a 45-degree angle to the airflow, they will each receive cosine of 45, or 71%, of the maximum possible frontal drag for each face. Additionally, each face is also going to receive sine of 45, also 71%, of the maximum possible skin drag for each face. If we now turn our attention to the XN and the YN faces, we will see that they are at an angle of 135 degrees to the airflow, so they will receive negative cosine of 135 degrees, 71%, of the maximum possible rear drag, along with sine of 135, 71%, of the maximum possible skin drag. Lastly, if we look at the ZN and ZP faces, they are at an angle of 90 degrees to the airflow, so they will receive no frontal drag, no rear drag, and maximum possible skin drag. Referencing our Mach number versus drag multiplier for each drag type chart, we can recall that skin drag is going to be very, very minimal for all of these faces, so the vast majority of drag is going to be coming from the frontal drag and the rear drag. Now it's time to talk about attachment nodes. You may have heard the following statement before. Open nodes increase drag. Covering the nodes will reduce drag. Well, this statement is only halfway correct. Nodes do not in and of themselves create drag. However, each node is tied to a specific face of the drag cube. When you attach parts via nodes, the W area of the attached face of the secondary part is subtracted from the occlusion area of the attached face of the primary part, and vice versa. If the value would be less than 0, it is instead set to 0. In this example, we attach the YP face of the primary part to the YN face of the secondary part. Since the two faces have the exact same area, you can see that the occlusion area of both faces is set to 0. It is important to note that this does not depend on the translation or position of either of the two parts. It does, however, depend on the rotation of the two parts. If we rotate the secondary part 90 degrees downwards, we are no longer using its YN face for the occlusion calculations. Instead, we are using the ZP face. As we can see, the ZP face's W area is not sufficiently large to fully cover the occlusion area of the YP face of the primary part, so it is no longer fully occluded. The reverse is true as well. We are no longer using the YP face of the primary part to occlude the YN face of the secondary part. Instead, the YN face of the secondary part is being occluded by the ZP face of the primary part. Again, the ZP face of the primary part does not have a large enough W area to fully cover and occlude the occlusion area of the YN face of the secondary part. You may have noticed that in the previous example we weren't just reducing the occlusion area of the various faces, we were also reducing the W drag. Anytime you reduce the occlusion area of a face, the W drag is also reduced. The equation that governs how this value changes is a little involved, and I don't want to get into it here. The important things to take away are that for a very blunt face, the value does not change much right up until the point that you fully occlude the face. For a face that is significantly pointier, it is much easier to fully reduce the W drag value to 0 without having to fully occlude the face. To fully reduce the W drag value to 0, the ratio between the W area of the attached face of the secondary part to the occlusion area of the attached face of the primary part must be larger than the W drag value you are attempting to zero out. Keeping in mind what we learned earlier in the video, namely that occlusion area and the fully transformed weight drag value are multiplied together to get the final drag coefficient for a given face. If either of the two values is 0, then the drag for the entire face will be 0. This is the primary goal of any node attachment. We are trying to get one or both of the weight drag and occlusion area values as close to 0 as we can reasonably achieve. Generally, you'll want to focus most of your effort on faces of the drag cube that are facing into or away from the airstream. Faces that are perpendicular to the airstream don't need as much attention because they will be producing mostly skin drag, and thus the overall drag of those faces will not be very high. If you're ever in any doubt about how much drag a given part is producing, don't forget to check the aero debug data in flight to get the exact value. Now let's take a look at how we can take these node attachment rules and work them to our advantage. In this first example, let's say you have a plane that you're trying to fly very fast at a very low altitude. Ordinary parts would burn up, but a heat shield will survive. However, heat shields are very draggy because they have a very blunt front face. What we could do is take a regular nose cone and attach it to the front node of the heat shield, thereby occluding the front face. We can then offset the nose cone behind the heat shield so that it is protected from aerodynamic heating, and then flip it around 180 degrees so that it takes rear drag instead of frontal drag. The end result is that we get the best of both worlds. Our nose cone is very resistant to heating while also being very low drag. Next, we're going to take a look at the Rapier engine. You can see here that the YN face of the Rapier engine is pretty blunt and fully exposed. This is going to generate a significant amount of drag, especially during the toughest part of any spaceplane's flight, right at sea level trying to break the sound barrier. What we can do to help alleviate this problem is attach a nose cone to the YN face, and then offset it into the Rapier so that it no longer blocks the thrust coming out of the nozzles. This gives us a jet engine that still produces thrust, but has a very low drag profile, since we have replaced the very blunt YN face of a jet engine with the very streamlined YP face of a nose cone. And with those examples out of the way, I think it's about time that we wrap things up. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I tried to make it as accurate as possible, but if I missed anything, let me know in the comments. And stay tuned, because there will be several new tutorial videos coming out in the future, as well as many missions I can't wait to share with you all. Thank you for watching.